In rural Montana, a 72-year-old retired schoolteacher was about to uncover a devastating family betrayal. What began as a simple request to help her grandchildren with college tuition turned shocking when her daughter uttered those cutting words, "You're holding us back," words that would change the course of generational wealth and shatter a family's foundation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Margaret Sullivan wasn't your typical doting grandmother. For 45 years, she'd educated 3 generations of children in Whitefish, Montana, known for her unwavering dedication and financial wisdom. When she discovered her daughter's secret plans to access her inheritance early, she had no idea she was walking into a calculated scheme that would force her to make the most painful decision of her life. Margaret's quiet removal of her daughter from her will would lead to a revelation that changed everything. The December wind howled against the windows of Margaret Sullivan's cedar cabin as she stirred her morning coffee, watching snowflakes dance across her 3-acre property. The pristine blanket of white covered the pine trees that she and her late husband Thomas had planted over 40 years ago when they first built their dream home in the mountains outside Whitefish. At 72, Margaret's hands showed the weathered signs of a life fully lived, small brown spots dotting her skin, blue veins prominent beneath the surface, but they remained steady as she lifted the ceramic mug to her lips. Her silver hair was pulled back in its usual practical bun, and reading glasses hung from a beaded chain around her neck, resting against her forest green sweater. The coffee was strong and black, just as Thomas had preferred it during their 52 years of marriage. She still made it the same way, a small tribute to the man who had built this life with her, who had worked alongside her to create something worth passing down to their children and grandchildren. Before we continue this story, tell us where you're watching from. And if this resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something truly special for you. On the kitchen table sat a neat stack of papers, financial statements, property deeds, and her recently updated will. Margaret had spent the morning reviewing everything with meticulous care. Teaching high school economics for 45 years had given her a keen eye for numbers and planning. Even in retirement, she approached her finances with the same methodical attention she'd once given to lesson plans. The cabin around her told the story of a life carefully built. Handcrafted bookshelves lined the living room walls, filled with classics she'd taught and loved. A quilt her mother had made draped over the back of Thomas's favorite leather armchair. Family photos chronicled decades of holidays, graduations, and ordinary moments made special simply because they were shared. And there, prominent among them, was a photo of her daughter Elizabeth and son-in-law James on their wedding day, beaming with the particular hope of young people who believe the future holds only good things. Beside it, more recent pictures of her grandchildren, Chloe, 17 and already applying to colleges, and Ryan, 14 and growing taller than his father. Margaret sighed, her eyes lingering on Elizabeth's face in the photo. They had always been close, or so she'd thought. Even when Elizabeth and James moved to Bozeman for his job as a hospital administrator, they'd made the 3-hour drive back to Whitefish regularly. The distance had never seemed to matter. Until recently. The phone calls had grown shorter, the visits less frequent. There was a new tension in Elizabeth's voice when they spoke, especially when the conversation turned to the future or finances. Margaret had tried to ignore it, to tell herself it was just the stress of raising teenagers, but the mother's intuition that had served her for 4 decades was sounding an alarm she couldn't silence. The ringing of her phone interrupted her thoughts. Elizabeth's name flashed on the screen, as if summoned by Margaret's concerns. "Hello, darling," Margaret answered, her voice warm despite her unease. "Hi, Mom," Elizabeth replied. There was that tension again, like a guitar string wound too tight. "How are you feeling?" The question carried the particular weight of a daughter checking on an aging parent, and Margaret bristled slightly at the implication. She was 72, not 92, and still hiked 3 miles through the mountains every morning, weather permitting. "I'm perfectly fine," she said, perhaps a bit more crisply than intended. "The doctor says my blood pressure is better than his." Elizabeth laughed, but it sounded forced. "That's great, Mom. Listen, James and I were thinking we might drive up this weekend. There's something we'd like to discuss with you." Margaret's hand tightened around her coffee mug. There it was, the conversation she'd been sensing on the horizon. "Of course," she said, keeping her voice level. "I'd love to see you all. Will the children be coming?" "No, not this time. Chloe has a volleyball tournament, and Ryan's staying at a friend's house." The absence of her grandchildren sent another warning signal. Whatever this conversation was going to be, Elizabeth didn't want the children present for it. "I see," Margaret said. "Well, I'll make up the guest room and prepare your father's venison stew. You always loved that." Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. You don't need to go to any trouble, Elizabeth said quickly. We won't be staying overnight. It's just, we have some things to talk about. The chill that ran through Margaret had nothing to do with the Montana winter pressing against her windows. What kinds of things, Elizabeth? There was a pause, and Margaret could almost see her daughter weighing her words carefully. Financial things, Mom. Plans for the future. Your future and ours. And there it was, laid bare at last. The conversation that many aging parents dreaded. The one where children began to position themselves for inheritance, for control, for decisions that weren't yet theirs to make. I see, Margaret said again, though this time the words carried a different weight. Saturday then? We'll be there around noon, if that works. It works just fine, Margaret replied, her teacher's voice returning, the one that had quieted rowdy classrooms with nothing more than a slight shift in tone. I'll see you both then. After they hung up, Margaret set the phone down carefully on the kitchen table and looked around her home, the home she had built, paid for, maintained, and loved. The home that, apparently, was now the subject of financial things and plans for the future. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered mountains that had been the backdrop to her life. Thomas had chosen this spot. Specifically, had fallen in love with the view and promised her that they would grow old watching the seasons change across those peaks. And they had, until cancer had taken him 3 years ago, leaving her to witness those seasonal changes alone. They're coming to talk about my money, Thomas, she said to the empty room, a habit she'd developed in widowhood. Your daughter and that husband of hers want to discuss my future. She could almost hear his reply, the gentle humor that had balanced her more serious nature. Be fair, Maggie. She's your daughter too, especially when she's being stubborn. Margaret smiled despite herself. It was true. Elizabeth had inherited Margaret's determination, her focus, her inability to let go of an idea once it had taken hold. Those qualities had served her well as she built her career in marketing, rising to a director position at a respected firm in Bozeman. But they had also created a certain rigidity, a blindness to perspectives that didn't align with her own. Turning back to the kitchen table, Margaret gathered the financial documents and returned them to her study. If Elizabeth wanted to discuss money, Margaret would be prepared. Not as a mother humoring her child, but as the woman who had managed their family finances for 5 decades, who had put herself and Thomas through college while working full-time, who had paid off their mortgage 15 years early through careful planning and strategic investments. As she filed the papers away in her immaculate home office, Margaret's eye caught on a framed photo of Elizabeth's graduation from Montana State. Her daughter stood proud in her cap and gown, flanked by Margaret and Thomas, all three beaming at the camera. It had been a joyous day, made all the sweeter by the knowledge that Elizabeth was graduating debt-free, thanks to the college fund Margaret and Thomas had started on the day she was born. That fund had been the first of many careful financial decisions, all designed to secure their family's future. The rental properties in Whitefish that generated steady income. The investments that had weathered economic downturns. The life insurance policy that had provided for Margaret after Thomas's death. None of it had been accidental. All of it had been planned with the meticulous care that defined Margaret Sullivan's approach to life. And now Elizabeth wanted to discuss it? We'll see about that, Margaret murmured, closing the file cabinet with a decisive click. The following days passed in a blur of preparation. Not for the venison stew or the guest room, Elizabeth had made it clear they wouldn't be staying, but for the conversation to come. Margaret reviewed her will, spoke with her attorney, and organized documentation of every major financial decision she'd made since Thomas's death. By Saturday morning, she was ready. The kitchen table that had hosted 50 years of family meals was now set for a different kind of gathering. A single folder sat at Margaret's place, containing only the documents she had decided were relevant to whatever discussion Elizabeth and James had in mind. The sound of tires on the gravel driveway alerted her to their arrival. Through the window, she watched her daughter's silver SUV come to a stop beside her own sensible Subaru. Elizabeth emerged first, her camel hair coat and designer boots marking her as someone who had left rural Montana behind for a more urbane existence. James followed, tall and distinguished in his charcoal overcoat, his once dark hair now silver. At the temples. They made a handsome couple, Margaret had to admit. Successful, polished, the kind of people who moved with the easy confidence of those accustomed to being respected and obeyed. As they approached the cabin, Margaret noticed how they walked in perfect sync, shoulders nearly touching, a united front. Whatever this conversation was going to be, they had already discussed it thoroughly between themselves. Margaret opened the door before they could knock. Elizabeth. James. Come in out of the cold. Mom, Elizabeth stepped forward to embrace And Margaret accepted the hug, noting how her daughter held herself slightly apart, maintaining a careful distance even in this most basic physical expression of affection. "You look well." "Thank you. So do you both." Margaret stepped back to allow them entry. "Can I take your coats?" The pleasantries continued as they settled in the living room, comments about the drive, the weather, how beautiful the mountains looked in winter. Margaret served coffee in her best china cups, the ones reserved for special occasions. Whatever this was, it certainly qualified as special. Finally, when the preliminary conversation had exhausted itself, an awkward silence fell. Elizabeth glanced at James, who gave a slight nod, their nonverbal communication so practiced it was almost imperceptible. "Mom," Elizabeth began, setting her coffee cup down carefully on its saucer. "We wanted to talk to you about your situation here." "My situation?" Margaret repeated, her voice neutral. "Yes. Living alone in this big house, so far from town. Especially with winter coming on." Ah. So that was the approach they had chosen. Concern for her welfare. Margaret had anticipated this opening gambit and was prepared. "I've lived through 69 Montana winters, Elizabeth. This one doesn't particularly concern me." Elizabeth exchanged another glance with James before continuing. "It's not just the weather, Mom. It's everything. You're getting older. This place requires a lot of maintenance. The driveway needs plowing, the roof needs clearing of snow, the pipes can freeze." "All issues I've managed successfully since your father died," Margaret pointed out. "And for decades before that when he traveled for work." "But you shouldn't have to manage them alone," James interjected, his voice carrying the practiced compassion of a hospital administrator accustomed to delivering difficult news. "That's what we want to talk about. Options that would make your life easier." Margaret took a deliberate sip of her coffee, using the moment to study her son-in-law over the rim of her cup. James Cameron had always been ambitious. A good provider. For Elizabeth and the children, certainly, but a man whose eyes were perpetually fixed on the next rung of the ladder. The next promotion, the next salary increase, the next status symbol. "What kinds of options?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. "We've been looking at some wonderful retirement communities in Bozeman," Elizabeth said, her voice brightening with rehearsed enthusiasm. "Beautiful apartments with all the amenities you could want. No maintenance, no shoveling snow, no isolation. And you'd be close to us and the grandchildren." "I see," Margaret said, setting down her own cup. "And what would happen to my home?" Another glance between Elizabeth and James. This was the crux of it, the real purpose behind their visit. "Well," James said, leaning forward slightly, "property values in Whitefish have skyrocketed in the last few years. Especially for a place like this, with acreage and mountain views. We've had a preliminary assessment done, and you've had my property assessed without my knowledge." Margaret interrupted, her voice carrying the sharp edge that had silenced generations of students. "Not officially," Elizabeth jumped in quickly. "Just an informal conversation with a realtor friend. But Mom, the numbers are impressive. This place could sell for over $2 million. Maybe more. $2 million. The figure hung in the air between them. A substantial sum, certainly, but Margaret knew it wasn't really about the money. It was about control. About decisions. About who got to determine the course of her remaining years. "And what would happen to this $2 million? Margaret asked, though again, she knew the answer. "It would be invested, of course," James replied smoothly. "Managed properly to provide for your care and eventually benefit the family." "Managed by whom?" "Well, we've spoken with our financial advisor," Elizabeth said. "He's excellent, Mom. He's helped us grow our own portfolio significantly. He could do the same with yours." Margaret nodded slowly, taking in the complete picture of what they were proposing. Sell her home. Move to Bozeman. Hand over the proceeds to be managed by their financial advisor. Surrender her independence, her autonomy, and her decision-making authority in one fell swoop. "And if I don't want to sell my home?" she asked, her voice level. Elizabeth's expression shifted, compassion giving way to something harder. "Mom, be practical. You can't stay here forever. Eventually, you'll need assistance. Care. This is the perfect time to make this transition, while you're still healthy and can enjoy the benefits of a retirement community." "While I'm still healthy," Margaret repeated. "Yes, I am still quite healthy, aren't I? Fully capable of making my own decisions and managing my own affairs." "Nobody's saying you're not capable, Mom," Elizabeth said, but her tone suggested otherwise. "We're just trying to plan ahead. To make sure everything is taken care of before there's a crisis." "A crisis of your imagining," Margaret noted. "Not one that currently exists." James shifted in his seat, his administrator's patience wearing thin. Margaret, we're just trying to help. To find the best solution for everyone. And there it was, the truth slipping out. Not the best solution for Margaret, but for everyone. For Elizabeth and James, who had their eyes on her property value. For their financial advisor, who would earn commissions managing her money. For a plan that had been conceived and developed without her input or consent. I appreciate your concern, Margaret said, rising from her chair with the straight-backed posture of a woman who had spent decades commanding classrooms. But I'm not selling my home, and I'm not moving to Bozeman. Elizabeth's face flushed. With frustration. Mom, please just consider it. Visit the retirement community. Talk to the financial advisor. Don't dismiss this outright. I'm not dismissing anything, Elizabeth. I'm making an informed decision based on what I want for my life, just as I have always done. But you're not just deciding for yourself. Elizabeth's voice rose, the careful veneer of concern cracking to reveal the frustration beneath. Your decisions affect all of us. The family legacy, the inheritance, the future. My inheritance, Margaret corrected quietly. My future. That's so selfish. The words burst from Elizabeth like water through a breaking dam. You're sitting on a $2 million property that's only going to decline in value as it gets older and needs more maintenance. You're holding on to investments that could be working harder for the family. She stopped abruptly, realizing she had revealed too much. But it was too late. The truth had been laid bare between them. I'm holding you back, Margaret finished for her. That's what you were going to say, isn't it? I'm holding you back from what you believe should be yours. The silence that followed was deafening. James looked uncomfortable, caught between supporting his wife and recognizing the inappropriate nature of her outburst. Elizabeth's face had gone from flushed to pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. That's not what I meant, she said finally. But the denial lacked conviction. I think it's exactly what you meant, Margaret replied. She turned and walked to her study, returning a moment later with a document she had prepared for just this possibility. You should know that I've made some changes to my will. Elizabeth's eyes widened, and James leaned forward, his attention suddenly sharpened. What kinds of changes? He asked. I've established a trust for Chloe and Ryan's education. It will pay directly to their colleges of choice, covering tuition, room, board, and books. They'll also each receive a lump sum upon graduation to help them start their adult lives without debt. And the rest? Elizabeth's voice was barely above a whisper. The rest, this property, my investments, and remaining assets, will be divided between the Mountain Conservation Trust and the Whitefish Educational Foundation. The trust will maintain these 3 acres in perpetuity as a natural habitat. The foundation will establish a scholarship fund in your father's name for students pursuing careers in teaching. The color drained completely from Elizabeth's face. You're cutting us out of your will? I'm ensuring my legacy reflects my values, Margaret corrected. Just as you suggested I should be thinking about the future. This is insane, Elizabeth stood abruptly, her coffee cup rattling in its saucer. You can't do this. I already have, Margaret replied, her voice steady. The paperwork was finalized yesterday. We'll contest it, James said, lawyer-like even in his shock. You can't just disinherit your only child. Actually, I can. Montana law is quite clear on the matter. As long as I'm of sound mind, which my doctor and attorney have recently certified, I can distribute my assets however I choose. And I choose to support education and conservation, the 2 causes your father and I believed in most deeply. Elizabeth was shaking now, tears welling in her eyes. Mom, please. Think about what you're doing. I have thought about it, Elizabeth. Very carefully. Just as you and James have clearly thought about your plans for my property and assets. Margaret's voice remained calm, though her heart was breaking inside her chest. This was her daughter, her only child, the baby she had nursed and the young woman she had guided and the adult she had loved fiercely for 45 years. But this was also a woman who had just revealed that she viewed her mother as an obstacle to her own financial gain. This conversation is over, Margaret said, standing to signal the end of their visit. I think it's best if you leave now. Mom, Elizabeth began, but James placed a restraining hand on her arm. Let's go, Liz, he said quietly. We all need time to cool down. They gathered their coats in tense silence. At the door, Elizabeth turned back, her expression a complicated mixture of anger, hurt, and disbelief. You'll regret this, Mom. When you're alone and need help, when this house becomes too much for you, you'll wish you hadn't pushed us away. Margaret met her daughter's gaze steadily. I'm not pushing you away, Elizabeth. I'm refusing to be treated as an inconvenience standing between you and what you believe you deserve. There's a difference. The door closed behind them with a finality that echoed through the cabin. Margaret stood in the silence they left behind, listening to the SUV's engine start and the sound of tires on gravel fade into the distance. Only, when she was certain they were gone, did she allow her composure to crumble. She sank into Thomas's leather armchair, her body suddenly feeling every one of her 72 years, and let the tears come. "Oh, Thomas," she whispered to the empty room. "What have I done? What has become of our little girl?" The snow continued to fall outside her window, covering the mountains in pristine white, beautiful and unforgiving as the truth that had been revealed today. Margaret Sullivan had discovered the price of her independence, and it was the loss of the relationship she had treasured most in the world. She had won the battle for control of her life and her legacy. But as she sat alone in the gathering darkness, watching the snow blanket the world outside, she wondered if the victory had been worth the cost. The fire in the hearth crackled and popped, casting long shadows across the cabin floor as evening descended. Margaret remained in Thomas's chair, emotionally drained but with a strange sense of clarity she hadn't felt in months. The confrontation had been painful, but at least the pretense was over. The careful dance of politeness covering underlying resentments had finally ended, leaving the harsh truth exposed between them. She reached for her phone, scrolling to find photos of Chloe and Ryan. There they were at the lake last summer, laughing as they jumped from the dock into the clear mountain water. Would she still be allowed to see them now? Or would Elizabeth and James limit her access to the grandchildren as punishment for her decision? The thought sent a fresh wave of pain through her chest. She had always been a hands-on grandmother. Attending school events, teaching Chloe to bake her famous huckleberry pie, showing Ryan how to identify birds by their calls in the forest behind her home. The possibility of losing that connection was almost unbearable. "But what choice did I have, Thomas?" she asked the empty room. "Let them sell our home out from under me? Hand over everything we built to their financial advisor?" She could almost hear his answer, practical as always. "You did what you had to do, Maggie. Standing your ground doesn't make you wrong." Margaret sighed and pushed herself up from the chair. Sitting here feeling sorry for herself wouldn't solve anything. She had made her decision, and now she had to live with the consequences. She would reach out to the grandchildren directly tomorrow, make it clear that her door was always open to them regardless of the situation with their parents. In the meantime, there was no sense in wasting the venison stew she had prepared. She would have dinner, grade the stack of essays from the creative writing class she still taught at the community center twice a week, and then get some sleep. Tomorrow was another day, and Margaret Sullivan had never been one to surrender to despair. As she served herself a bowl of the rich, fragrant stew, the phone rang again. Her heart leapt, hoping it might be Elizabeth calling to apologize, to find a way forward. But the caller ID showed a different name, Catherine Reynolds, her oldest friend and former teaching colleague. "Hello, Catherine," Margaret answered, making an effort to keep the emotional exhaustion from her voice. "Margaret, thank goodness. I've been trying to reach you for hours." Catherine's voice was tight with concern. "Elizabeth just called me, absolutely beside herself. She said you've written her out of your will and forbidden her from seeing you. What on earth is going on?" Margaret closed her eyes, a headache beginning to pulse at her temples. So that was the narrative Elizabeth had chosen, that she was the victim of her unreasonable mother's cruelty, rather than the architect of her own disinheritance. "That's not exactly what happened, Catherine," Margaret said carefully. "Elizabeth and James came here today with a plan to sell my home and move me to a retirement community in Bozeman. When I refused, things became unpleasant." "Unpleasant how?" Catherine had known Margaret for 40 years, had stood beside her through Thomas's illness and death, had witnessed firsthand Margaret's unwavering devotion to her family. She wasn't easily swayed by dramatic phone calls. "Elizabeth made it clear that she views my home and assets as her inheritance, one that I'm holding back by continuing to live independently." The words still stung to repeat. "So yes, I did inform her that I've updated my will to establish educational trusts for the grandchildren and donate the remainder to causes Thomas and I believed in." "Oh, Margaret." Catherine's voice softened with understanding. "I'm so sorry. That must have been dreadful." It was, Margaret admitted, the simple acknowledgement of her pain bringing fresh tears to her eyes. "My own daughter, Catherine. Looking at my home like it's an investment property standing between her and $2 million. "Did she really say you were holding her back?" Catherine asked. "She did. She was angry, of course, but I think that made her more honest than she intended to be." Margaret took a steadying breath. "I keep wondering where I went wrong. How did I raise a daughter who values my property more than my autonomy?" "You didn't go wrong," Catherine said firmly. "You raised an intelligent, determined woman who has unfortunately allowed ambition to overshadow compassion. That's not a reflection on your parenting, Margaret. That's Elizabeth making her own poor choices." Perhaps, Margaret wasn't entirely convinced. but I can't help feeling I've failed somewhere along the way. Well, I'm coming over, Catherine declared, in the no-nonsense tone that had kept generations of high school students in line. No arguments. You shouldn't be alone right now, and I have a bottle of that Cabernet you like. Despite everything, Margaret felt a smile tug at her lips. Catherine, it's snowing, and you live 30 minutes away. I have snow tires and four-wheel drive. I'll be there in 45 minutes. Don't argue with me, Margaret Sullivan. I taught alongside you for 30 years. I know all your tactics. After they hung up, Margaret felt a small measure of the weight lift from her shoulders. This was the difference between true friendship and the opportunistic concern Elizabeth and James had displayed. Catherine was driving through a snowstorm to provide comfort, not to stake a claim on Margaret's assets. As promised, Catherine arrived 45 minutes later, bearing not only wine but also a foil-wrapped plate of her famous oatmeal raisin cookies. The two women settled in the living room, the fire rebuilt and crackling, as Margaret recounted the full details of the confrontation. The worst part, Margaret said, halfway through her second glass of wine, is that I don't think they even see what they did wrong. In their minds, they were being practical, making sensible plans for my future and the family's financial security. At your expense, Catherine pointed out. Without your input or consent. Exactly. As if I'm already incapable of managing my own affairs, despite all evidence to the contrary. Margaret gestured around her immaculate home, at the graded essays neatly stacked on the side table, at the financial documents organized in her study. I'm not senile, I'm not infirm, and I'm not ready to surrender my independence. Catherine nodded, her gray curls bouncing with the movement. Have you spoken with your attorney about protecting yourself further? I hate to say it, but if they were willing to go this far, they might try other tactics. Like having me declared incompetent? Margaret had considered this possibility. That's why I had a full cognitive assessment done last month, along with a physical. The results are on file with my doctor and my attorney. I'm in excellent health, both mentally and physically. Good, Catherine approved. Stay one step ahead. That's always been your strength as a teacher and as a person. They talked late into the night, the wine and friendship easing the sharp edges of Margaret's pain. By the time Catherine reluctantly prepared to leave, having been persuaded to take Margaret's guest room instead of driving home in the increasingly heavy snow, Margaret felt steadier, more certain of her path forward. Thank you, she said as they climbed the stairs to the bedrooms. For coming, for listening, for not thinking I'm a terrible mother for disinheriting my only child. Catherine stopped, turning to face her friend directly. Margaret Sullivan, you are the most dedicated mother I have ever known. You worked 2 jobs to give Elizabeth everything she needed. You never missed a school event or a dance recital. You and Thomas sacrificed for decades to provide her with opportunities neither of you had. If she can't see the value in that, if all she sees is the monetary worth of your property, then she's the one who has failed, not you. The words were like a balm to Margaret's wounded heart. She slept soundly that night for the first time in weeks, her dreams free of the anxiety that had plagued her since noticing the change in Elizabeth's behavior. In the morning, Catherine departed after extracting a promise that Margaret would call if she needed anything, day or night. Left alone with her thoughts once more, Margaret made a decision. She would not allow this rift to fester. She would reach out to her grandchildren directly and then give Elizabeth time to reconsider her position. Perhaps, with space and reflection, her daughter would recognize the impact of her words and actions. She sent text messages to both Chloe and Ryan, casual and loving, making no mention of the conflict with their parents. To Chloe, she inquired about her college applications and reminded her that she was available to review essays if needed. To Ryan, she asked about his latest science project and shared a photo of a pine grosbeak that had visited her bird feeder that morning, knowing his interest in ornithology. Then she settled in to wait, to give Elizabeth the space to process her anger and disappointment. Margaret had stood her ground, protected her autonomy, and secured her legacy according to her own values. Now it was up to Elizabeth to decide whether property and inheritance were more important than the relationship with her mother. As she gazed out at the snow-covered mountains, Margaret found herself hoping that the strength and determination she had passed to her daughter would eventually lead Elizabeth back to the values that truly mattered: family, respect, and love. That couldn't be measured in dollars or property assessments. The winter light cast long shadows across the pristine snow, the beauty of Montana in December a reminder that even in the coldest seasons, life continued beneath the surface, waiting for the thaw that would inevitably come. A week passed with no word from Elizabeth. Margaret's text messages to her grandchildren had received only brief, polite responses that felt carefully monitored. Chloe had thanked her for the essay offer but mentioned she already had help from her school counselor. Ryan had sent a thumbs-up emoji to the bird photo but nothing more. The silence from her daughter remained complete and deafening. Margaret maintained her routines: morning coffee on the porch watching the sunrise over the mountains, weekly creative writing classes at the community center, volunteer hours at the local library. She refused to let the family rift disrupt the structure that had sustained her since Thomas's death. On the surface, she projected the same calm competence that had defined her 4 decades in the classroom, but each night alone in the cabin brought waves of doubt and grief that threatened to overwhelm her. On Friday morning, as Margaret cleared fresh snow from her walkway, the rumble of an unfamiliar vehicle caught her attention. A sleek black SUV navigated the winding driveway, coming to a stop beside her Subaru. For a moment, her heart leapt with hope that Elizabeth had returned, ready to reconcile. Instead, a tall man in an expensive overcoat emerged, Richard Bennett, Elizabeth and James's financial advisor. "Mrs. Sullivan," he called, picking his way carefully across the snowy ground in leather shoes clearly unsuited for Montana winters. "I hope I'm not intruding. Elizabeth Cameron suggested I stop by while I'm in the area." Margaret leaned on her snow shovel, studying the man approaching her. Mid-50s, immaculately groomed, with the practiced smile of someone accustomed to charming wealthy clients. "Did she? How convenient that you happen to be in rural Whitefish, 3 hours from your office in Bozeman." His smile faltered slightly at her directness. "I have other clients in the area. Elizabeth mentioned you might be interested in discussing some financial planning options." "Did she also mention that I explicitly rejected those options when she and James presented them last weekend?" Margaret asked, making no move to invite him inside. Richard shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for this reception. "She indicated there had been a misunderstanding. That perhaps if the options were presented by a professional, with proper data and projections, there was no misunderstanding, Mr. Bennett," Margaret interrupted. "My daughter and son-in-law want me to sell my home and turn the proceeds over to you to manage." I declined. "That's not a misunderstanding, that's a disagreement. Mrs. Sullivan, I can assure you that any financial plan would be designed to benefit you first and foremost," he said, adopting the soothing tone financial advisors reserved for reluctant clients. "Would it?" Margaret asked. "Tell me, what commission rate do you charge for managing investment accounts of $2 million? The question caught him off guard. "Well, our fee structure is tiered based on the size of the portfolio, starting at 1.5% annually for accounts under $5 million. So approximately $30,000 a year from my money," Margaret calculated quickly. "Plus transaction fees, I imagine. And who referred you to Elizabeth and James initially?" His discomfort visibly increased. "I believe James's colleague at the hospital recommended our firm." "And did you provide that colleague with a referral bonus?" Margaret pressed. "There is a standard appreciation program for clients who refer new business, yes." Margaret nodded, the picture becoming clearer. "So James's colleague benefits from referring you, you benefit from managing my money, and Elizabeth and James benefit from having access to my assets. Everyone benefits except me, who loses my home and independence in the process." Richard's professional demeanor began to crack. "Mrs. Sullivan, I think you're mischaracterizing. I taught economics for 45 years, Mr. Bennett," Margaret said, straightening to her full height. "I understand financial incentives quite well. Now, unless you've driven 3 hours through snow to discuss something other than selling my home, I believe this conversation is concluded." "Actually," he said, reaching into his coat to extract a folder, "I did prepare some information about the property values in this area and the tax advantages of selling now versus." "Good day, Mr. Bennett," Margaret said firmly, turning to walk back toward her cabin. "Mrs. Sullivan, please," he called after her. "At least take the information. Review it at your leisure." Margaret paused at her front door. "My leisure is precisely what I'm protecting, Mr. Bennett. My leisure, my home, and my right to make my own decisions without pressure from those who stand to profit from them." She closed the door behind her, leaning against it as she listened to the sound of his retreating footsteps, followed by the slam of a car door and the engine starting. Only when the sound had faded completely did she allow herself to slide down to the floor, her body trembling with a mixture of anger and exhaustion. "Can you believe that, Thomas?" she asked the empty cabin. "They sent their financial advisor to convince me. As if I'd be swayed by a stranger in an expensive suit when I wouldn't listen to my own daughter." The silence that answered her felt heavier than usual. In moments like this, the absence of her husband was a physical ache. Thomas would have known exactly what to say to make her laugh, to put this situation in perspective. He had always been her ballast, keeping her steady when life's currents threatened to pull her under. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message notification. With a sigh, she pulled it from her pocket, half expecting more unwelcome communication. from Elizabeth or James. Instead, she found a message from Chloe. "Grandma, can you pick me up from school today? I need to talk to you. Don't tell Mom and Dad." Margaret stared at the message in surprise. Chloe's school was in Bozeman, a 3-hour drive away. For her granddaughter to reach out like this, something significant must be happening. Despite her concern about further antagonizing Elizabeth, Margaret couldn't ignore what sounded like a plea for help. "Of course, sweetheart," she texted back. "What time?" "3:30, I'll be at the south entrance." "Thank you." Margaret glanced at the clock. It was just past 11 a.m. If she left immediately, she would make it to Bozeman with time to spare. She moved quickly, changing into a fresh sweater, gathering her purse and keys, and preparing the cabin for her absence. She might be spending the night in Bozeman, depending on what Chloe needed. As she backed the Subaru down the driveway, Margaret felt a renewed sense of purpose. Whatever was happening with Chloe, she would be there for her granddaughter. Elizabeth might be angry about the will, but Margaret would never abandon her grandchildren, regardless of the tension with their parents. The drive to Bozeman passed in a blur of snow-covered landscapes and small Montana towns. Margaret's mind raced with possibilities. Was Chloe in some kind of trouble? Was she upset about the family conflict? Had something happened at school? By the time she pulled into the high school parking lot at 3:25, Margaret had imagined a dozen scenarios, each more concerning than the last. She parked near the south entrance as instructed and waited, watching students stream out of the building in their winter coats and backpacks. Finally, she spotted Chloe, tall and slender like her mother had been at 17, her dark hair tucked under a knitted hat, scanning the parking lot with obvious anxiety. Margaret rolled down the passenger window and waved. Relief washed over Chloe's face as she hurried to the car, yanking open the door and sliding inside. "Grandma," she said, leaning across the console to embrace Margaret tightly. "You came. Thank you." "Of course I came," Margaret replied, returning the hug and noting with concern the tension in her granddaughter's body. "What's happening, sweetheart? Are you alright?" Chloe glanced back at the school entrance. "Can we just drive? I'll explain everything, I promise. I just don't want anyone to see me talking to you." The secrecy sent another wave of concern through Margaret, but she nodded, putting the car in gear and pulling away from the school. "Are you hungry? We could stop somewhere and talk. That cafe you like on Main Street?" Chloe suggested. "The one with the good hot chocolate?" "Perfect," Margaret agreed, heading toward downtown Bozeman. They drove in silence for several minutes, Chloe staring out the window with an unreadable expression. Finally, as they parked outside the cafe, she turned to her grandmother. "Mom and Dad had a huge fight last night," she said, her voice small. "About you and the will in the house. It was really bad, Grandma." Margaret's heart sank. "I'm so sorry you had to hear that, Chloe." "They didn't know I was listening," Chloe admitted. "But they were so loud, and I wanted to understand. What was happening? Why Mom's been crying and Dad's been so angry. Why they told us we couldn't answer your texts except with basic responses." They exited the car and entered the cafe, finding a quiet corner booth away from other patrons. After ordering hot chocolates and cinnamon rolls, Chloe continued her story. "Dad was yelling about how you'd ruined everything, how they'd been counting on your money for their retirement and for Ryan and me to go to good colleges. Mom was crying, saying she never should have said you were holding them back, that she'd destroyed their relationship with you." Margaret closed her eyes briefly, imagining the scene. "Chloe, whatever is happening between your parents and me, it doesn't change how I feel about you and Ryan. You know that, right?" "I know," Chloe nodded. "That's why I called you. Mom told Dad that you'd set up education trusts for us, that our college was taken care of no matter what. She was actually defending you, saying maybe you were right to be angry about how they approached you." This was unexpected. Margaret had assumed Elizabeth would be united with James in their anger. "Your mother said that?" "Yes. And then Dad got even angrier. He said Mom had ruined everything by losing her temper, that they should have been more subtle about getting you to sell the house." Chloe's expression hardened with a maturity beyond her years. "He said they needed to find another way to access your assets while you're still alive." A chill ran through Margaret. "What exactly did he say, Chloe?" "He said." Chloe hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "He said they needed to get you declared incompetent, that they could petition for guardianship and then make financial decisions for you." Mom freaked out completely, said she would never do that to you, that you're perfectly competent and it would be a lie. The waitress arrived with their order, forcing a pause in the conversation. Margaret stirred her hot chocolate mechanically, mind racing. James was actually considering trying to have her declared incompetent, a maneuver that would strip her of all legal rights and give them control of everything she owned. "What happened after your mother objected?" Margaret asked when the waitress had gone. More yelling. Dad said Mom needed to decide where her loyalty was, to her mother or to her family's future. Mom started crying again and said those weren't mutually exclusive, that they could figure out something that respected your wishes but still secured their future. And what did your father say to that? Chloe looked down at her untouched cinnamon roll. He said it was too late for compromise, that you'd made your position clear with the will changes, and now they needed to protect their interests before you decided to donate everything to charity. Margaret reached across the table to take Chloe's hand. I'm so sorry you're caught in the middle of this, sweetheart. This isn't something you should have to worry about. But I do worry, Chloe said, finally meeting Margaret's eyes. I worry about you all alone in that cabin. I worry about Mom crying herself to sleep. I worry about Dad being so focused on money that he can't see what he's doing to our family. The maturity in her granddaughter's assessment struck Margaret forcefully. At 17, Chloe was demonstrating more emotional intelligence than her father, seeing beyond immediate financial concerns to the deeper damage being done. Why did you want to see me today? Margaret asked gently. 2 reasons, Chloe replied, straightening her shoulders. First, I wanted to warn you about what Dad might try to do. I thought you should know. And the second reason? I got my acceptance letter from Montana State yesterday, Chloe said, a small smile breaking through her worry. Early decision. Full academic scholarship for the teaching program. I wanted to tell you first, because it's because of you I want to be a teacher. Pride and love swelled in Margaret's chest. Oh, Chloe. That's wonderful news. Your grandfather would be so proud. I was hoping. Chloe hesitated. I was hoping maybe I could live with you during college. Bozeman to Whitefish isn't that far. I could come home on weekends, help with the property. We could spend more time together. The offer touched Margaret deeply. Here was her granddaughter, reaching across the divide that adults had created, offering not just companionship but practical support, a solution that acknowledged Margaret's desire to remain independent while addressing legitimate concerns about her managing the property alone. I would love that, Chloe, Margaret said honestly. But we'd need your parents' approval, and given the current situation. I know, Chloe sighed. But maybe it could be part of a compromise? You keep your house, I get to live with my amazing grandmother while I study, and Mom and Dad don't have to worry about you being alone. It was an elegant solution, one that honored everyone's core concerns. Margaret couldn't help but marvel at her granddaughter's wisdom and diplomacy. It's worth discussing, Margaret agreed. But first, I need to address your father's plans regarding guardianship. That's a serious threat, Chloe, not just to my finances but to my basic rights. What will you do? Chloe asked, concern etching her young face. I'll speak with my attorney first thing tomorrow, Margaret said. And then I think it's time I had a direct conversation with your father. Not through your mother, not through a financial advisor, but face to face. He'll be angry if he knows. I told you, Chloe worried. I won't mention you, Margaret promised. I'll simply say that given our last conversation, I wanted to clarify my position and hear his concerns directly. She squeezed Chloe's hand. I won't put you in the middle. More than you already are. They finished their hot chocolates, the conversation shifting to lighter topics, Chloe's excitement about college, her design for her senior project, the books they'd both been reading. For a brief interlude, the tension lifted, allowing grandmother and granddaughter to connect as they always had, through shared interests and mutual respect. As they prepared to leave, Chloe asked the question Margaret had been dreading. Where are you staying tonight, Grandma? Our house? I think that might be uncomfortable for everyone, don't you? Margaret replied gently. I'll get a hotel room. In town. Mom will know I saw you when I don't come home right away, Chloe pointed out. Then let's not make her wonder, Margaret decided, pulling out her phone. I'll text her now and tell her you're with me. We'll be direct and honest, that's always been my policy, and I'm not changing it now. She composed a simple message, Elizabeth, Chloe is with me. We're having dinner in town. I'll have her home by 8 o'clock. We can talk then if you wish. The response came almost immediately, okay. Just that, neither warm nor hostile, simply acknowledgement. It was a start, at least. Let's get dinner at that Italian place you like, Margaret suggested, tucking her phone away. And you can tell me more about this teaching program. Are you thinking elementary or secondary? As they walked back to the car, Chloe linked her arm through Margaret's. Secondary. English literature, like you. I want to teach To Kill a Mockingbird and watch students discover it for the first time, the way you described. The simple statement, a granddaughter following in her grandmother's footsteps, carrying forward a legacy of education rather than just financial inheritance, brought tears to Margaret's eyes. This was what truly mattered, this transmission of values and passion across generations. Not property values or investment accounts, but the enduring impact of a life dedicated to learning and growth. Your grandfather used to say that a good teacher creates ripples that travel further than they can ever see, Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. It seems those ripples have reached you, Chloe. They've reached further than you know. Grandma, Chloe replied. Half my friends wish you'd been their teacher. Everyone at school still talks about Mrs. Sullivan's economics class and how you made them understand money better than their parents did. The irony wasn't lost on Margaret. She had taught generations of students to understand financial principles, to make wise decisions about money and value, including, apparently, everyone except her own daughter and son-in-law. After a leisurely dinner filled with more conversation about Chloe's future plans, Margaret drove to the Cameron home, a spacious two-story in one of Bozeman's newer developments. As they pulled into the driveway, Chloe tensed visibly. It'll be all right, Margaret assured her. Whatever happens between the adults in this family, you and Ryan are always my priority. Will you come inside? Chloe asked. Margaret considered the question carefully. I think I should. Running away from difficult conversations hasn't solved anything so far. They found Elizabeth alone in the kitchen, nursing a cup of tea at the island counter. She looked up when they entered, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, but her expression carefully neutral. Hi, Mom, she said quietly. Chloe, Ryan's upstairs. Dad's working late. Convenient timing, Margaret thought, but kept the observation to herself. Elizabeth. Thank you for letting me spend time with Chloe today. She's your granddaughter, Elizabeth replied. That relationship shouldn't be affected by other issues. I agree completely, Margaret said. Which is why I'd like to tell you that Chloe has been accepted to Montana State on a full academic scholarship for the teaching program. Pride briefly overtook the tension in Elizabeth's face. You were accepted? Why didn't you tell us? I just found out yesterday, Chloe said. And I wanted to tell Grandma first, since I'm following in her footsteps. Elizabeth's expression softened further. Of course. Congratulations, honey. Dad will be so proud. There's something else, Chloe continued, glancing at Margaret for support. I've asked Grandma if I could live with her during college. Commute on weekends or when I need to. Help her with the property. Elizabeth's eyes widened, darting between her daughter and mother. Live in Whitefish? That's a long commute, Chloe. Not if it's just weekends, Chloe argued. Lots of college students only come home every few weeks. And this way, Grandma wouldn't be alone, and her property would be taken care of, and I'd get to spend more time with her while I study. The strategic brilliance of Chloe's proposal wasn't lost on Elizabeth. Margaret could almost see her daughter processing the various angles, the practical solution it offered to concerns about Margaret living alone, the compromise it represented without requiring Margaret to sell her home. We can discuss it, Elizabeth said finally. When your father gets home. Of course, Chloe agreed. I'm going to go tell Ryan about Montana State. She hugged Margaret tightly. Thanks for today, Grandma. For everything. When Chloe had disappeared upstairs, an awkward silence fell between mother and daughter. Elizabeth fidgeted with her teacup, avoiding Margaret's gaze. She's an extraordinary young woman, Margaret said finally. You and James have done well with her. Thank you, Elizabeth replied, the simple acknowledgement seeming to release some of the tension in her shoulders. Mom, about last weekend, before we get into that, Margaret interrupted gently, I want to be clear about something. Whatever happens between us, whatever disagreements we have about property or finances or wills, Chloe and Ryan remain my grandchildren. I will always be there for them, always support them, always love them unconditionally. I know that, Elizabeth said softly. I would never try to keep them from you, despite what you might think after how things went. I'm glad to hear it, Margaret said. Because I've been worried that this conflict would damage those relationships too. Elizabeth finally looked up, meeting her mother's gaze directly. I said terrible things, Mom. Things I didn't mean, not really. I was frustrated and scared. Margaret interrupted, surprised. Of what? Of the future. Of not having enough. Of failing. Elizabeth's voice caught. James's position at the hospital isn't as secure as we've led everyone believe. There have been budget cuts, reorganizations. He's worried about being pushed into early retirement. This was new information, a piece of the puzzle Margaret hadn't possessed. Is that why you were so focused on my assets? Because of James's job insecurity? Elizabeth nodded, looking miserable. We've made some bad investments, Mom. The vacation property in Idaho that was supposed to be a rental income stream has been sitting empty for months. The stock options James got instead of a raise last year are underwater. We're not in immediate trouble, but long term. She trailed off. Why didn't you just tell me this? Margaret asked. Instead of trying to orchestrate my life without my knowledge? Because we were embarrassed, Elizabeth admitted. We're supposed to be the successful ones, the financially savvy generation. Not coming to our retired mother for help. Margaret sighed, understanding dawning. So instead, you tried to frame it as concern for my welfare. A practical solution to my living situation that would coincidentally solve your financial worries. It sounds awful when you put it like that, Elizabeth said, her cheeks flushing. But yes, that was essentially the plan. And then when you refused, I lost my temper and said that horrible thing about you holding us back. She looked up, tears in her eyes. I don't think that, Mom. I really don't. Margaret studied her daughter, seeing beyond the successful professional exterior to the frightened woman underneath, worried about her family's future and grasping at what seemed like an easy solution. Financial insecurity is terrifying, Margaret said gently. I understand that better than you might think. Your father and I had our own struggles when you were too young to remember. You did? Elizabeth seemed genuinely surprised. You always made everything seem so secure, so carefully planned. Because that was our job as parents, to provide stability and security for you. But there were lean years, difficult choices, sleepless nights wondering how we'd manage. Margaret smiled sadly. We just didn't burden you with those worries. Like we should have done with Chloe and Ryan, Elizabeth acknowledged, understanding dawning. Instead of letting them overhear arguments and sending them confused messages about family loyalty. The parallel wasn't lost on Margaret. The pattern was repeating, parents trying to shield children from financial realities, but in the process, creating new problems through lack of transparency. I think, Margaret said carefully, that we all need to have an honest conversation. Not about selling my home or changing my will, but about what each of us truly needs and what's possible within those parameters. James won't like it, Elizabeth warned. He's still angry about the will changes. Nevertheless, Margaret replied firmly. It's time for direct communication, not schemes and financial advisors showing up at my door. Elizabeth's head snapped. Up. What financial advisor? Mr. Bennett paid me a visit this morning, Margaret explained. Apparently at your suggestion. I never, Elizabeth stopped abruptly, realization dawning. James must have called him. Without telling me. Just as concerning tactics were being employed without Elizabeth's knowledge. The family dynamic was even more fractured than Margaret had realized. Elizabeth, Margaret said gently. There's something else we need to discuss. Something Chloe overheard about James considering guardianship proceedings. The color drained from Elizabeth's face. Mom, I swear to you, I would never support that. Never. I told James it was unconscionable even to suggest it. I believe you, Margaret assured her. But it concerns me deeply that it was suggested at all. You understand that would strip me of all legal rights, all agency over my own life. I know, Elizabeth whispered, looking horrified. Mom, I'm so sorry. This has all gone so far beyond what I ever intended. I just wanted everyone to be secure. Including me, Margaret pointed out. And security for me includes maintaining my independence and dignity. Surely we can find solutions that respect that while addressing your concerns about the future. Elizabeth nodded slowly. Like Chloe living with you during college. That's actually a really elegant solution to several problems. Your daughter is quite the diplomat, Margaret observed with pride. Far wiser than many of the adults in her life, it seems. For the first time in the conversation, Elizabeth smiled, a small, sad smile, but genuine nonetheless. She gets that from you, Mom. That wisdom and perspective. I've always admired it, even when I was too stubborn to show it. The simple acknowledgement felt like the first real step toward healing the rift between them. Not complete reconciliation, not yet, there were still difficult conversations ahead, especially with James, but a beginning. A recognition that beneath the conflict over assets and property lay deeper values they both cherished, family, security, wisdom, and love that couldn't be quantified in financial statements or property assessments. It's getting late, Margaret said, rising from her seat. I should check into my hotel. But perhaps we could all have breakfast tomorrow? You, me, James, and the children? Begin having those honest conversations we've been avoiding. Elizabeth hesitated, then nodded. I'll talk to James tonight. Prepare him. It won't be easy, but you're right. We need to stop talking around each other and start talking to each other. As Margaret gathered her purse to leave, Elizabeth suddenly stepped forward and embraced her, not the careful, distant hug of their last meeting, but a genuine one, full of the complicated love between mothers and daughters. I'm sorry, Mom, she whispered. I'm so sorry for all of this. I know, Margaret replied, returning the embrace. I am too. But we'll find a way forward. That's what family does. As she drove to her hotel through the snowy Bozeman streets, Margaret felt cautiously optimistic for the first time in weeks. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. James's anger and financial scheming were still significant obstacles, but at least she and Elizabeth had rediscovered the foundation of their relationship, the love and respect that had been temporarily obscured by fear and misunderstanding. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, difficult conversations, and probably more emotional revelations. But tonight, Margaret took comfort in knowing that the most important bonds, those between grandmother and grandchildren, between mother and daughter, remained intact, perhaps even strengthened by the honesty this crisis had finally forced into the open. Margaret arrived at the Cameron home precisely at 8 a.m. the following morning, determined to face whatever reception awaited her with dignity and resolve. She had spent a restless night in her hotel room, alternating between hope inspired by her conversation with Elizabeth and dread about confronting James. His willingness to consider having her declared incompetent, essentially legally erasing her autonomy, had shaken her more deeply than she cared to admit, even to herself. The house looked different in the morning light, less imposing, more like the family home it was meant to be. Christmas decorations adorned the porch, and through the front window, Margaret could see the glow of lights on a large tree in the living room. The holiday was just 3 weeks away, she realized with a pang. Would this be the first Christmas in 18 years that they didn't celebrate as a family? Before she could ring the doorbell, the door swung open to reveal Ryan, still in pajamas, his dark hair rumpled from sleep. "Grandma," he exclaimed, genuine delight lighting his face. At 14, he was at that awkward stage between boy and young man, his voice occasionally cracking and his limbs seeming too long for his body. But his smile was the same one that had melted Margaret's heart since he was a toddler. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said, stepping inside and embracing him. "You're up early for a Saturday. Mom said you were coming for breakfast," he explained, leading her toward the kitchen. "And I wanted to show you my science fair project before Dad gets all serious about money stuff." The casual mention of money stuff confirmed Margaret's suspicion that the children were far more aware of the family tension than the adults had acknowledged. "I'd love to see your project," she assured him. "What's the topic this year?" "Climate change effects on Montana bird migration patterns," Ryan announced proudly. "I've been tracking data from the Audubon Society and comparing it with historical records. Some species are arriving almost 2 weeks earlier than they did 50 years ago." "That sounds fascinating," Margaret said sincerely. Ryan's passion for ornithology had emerged early, nurtured by countless hours spent with her in the woods behind her cabin, identifying birds by their calls and markings. They entered the kitchen to find Elizabeth at the stove, flipping pancakes, while Chloe set the table. The scene of domestic normalcy was almost jarring after the emotional turbulence of recent days. "Good morning, Mom," Elizabeth greeted her, spatula in hand. "Coffee's fresh." "Thank you," Margaret replied, accepting a steaming mug from Chloe. She glanced around the kitchen. "Is James joining us?" A look passed between Elizabeth and Chloe, one of those silent communications that spoke volumes. "He'll be down shortly," Elizabeth said, her tone carefully neutral. "He was up late on a conference call with the hospital board." Translation: he was avoiding this meeting as long as possible. Margaret nodded, understanding the subtext. "Well, that gives Ryan time to show me his science project." For the next 15 minutes, Margaret immersed herself in Ryan's enthusiastic explanation of his research methodology and findings, asking questions that demonstrated her genuine interest. This was what mattered, she reminded herself, these connections, this sharing of knowledge and curiosity across generations. Not property values or investment accounts. The sound of footsteps on the stairs announced James's arrival. He entered the kitchen dressed for the day in pressed khakis and a button-down shirt, looking more like he was heading to a business meeting than a family breakfast. His expression was guarded, his posture tense. "Margaret," he acknowledged her with a nod. "I see everyone's up and about early." "Grandma's helping me with my science project, Dad," Ryan explained. "She suggested I include historical weather data along with the migration patterns to strengthen my conclusion." "That's helpful," James replied, pouring himself coffee and avoiding direct eye contact with Margaret. "But let's put the project away for now. Breakfast is ready, and we have other matters to discuss." Ryan's face fell, but he obediently gathered his materials. "Can I show you the rest later, Grandma?" he asked Margaret. "Absolutely," she promised. "I want to hear all about those juncos you've been tracking." They gathered around the table, an outwardly normal family having breakfast together. But the undercurrents of tension were impossible to ignore, James mechanically cutting his pancakes into precise squares, Elizabeth watching him anxiously, the children exchanging glances laden with worry. So, James said finally, setting down his fork with deliberate care. Elizabeth tells me you two had a conversation yesterday. We did, Margaret confirmed. It was overdue. And Chloe has been accepted to Montana State, he continued, his tone suggesting this information had been newly shared with him as well. With a scholarship. A full academic scholarship, Chloe corrected quietly. For the teaching program. Yes, well. James took a sip of his coffee. Congratulations are in order, I suppose, though we had hoped you'd consider more lucrative career paths. Teaching isn't about the money, Dad, Chloe replied with a quiet dignity that made Margaret's heart swell with pride. It's about making a difference. Like Grandma did. James's mouth tightened, but he didn't argue the point. I understand you've also proposed living with your grandmother during college, he said instead. That seems impractical given the distance. Actually, Elizabeth interjected, I think it could work quite well. Chloe would be on campus during the week, with Mom on weekends. It addresses several concerns at once. What concerns would those be? James asked, his tone deceptively casual. Mom wouldn't be alone at the property, Elizabeth explained. Chloe would have a quiet place to study away from campus distractions. We wouldn't need to worry about dorm costs or meal plans. Everyone benefits. Margaret watched this exchange with interest, noting how Elizabeth was framing the arrangement. In terms James would find compelling, practical benefits, financial advantages. Her daughter knew her husband well, knew which arguments would resonate with him. And what about when Chloe graduates? James asked. Back to Margaret living alone in that isolated cabin? I've managed quite well for 3 years, James. Margaret pointed out. And will continue to do so. But that's not really what you're concerned about, is it? The directness of her question seemed to catch him off guard. He set down his coffee cup carefully. What do you mean? I mean that your concern isn't truly about my welfare, Margaret said calmly. It's about what happens to my assets, specifically my property and investments. Ryan and Chloe exchanged uncomfortable glances. Elizabeth cleared her throat. Perhaps the children should. No, Margaret interrupted gently. I think they should stay. This affects them too, and they're old enough to understand what's happening. In fact, they probably understand more than we've given them credit for. James's jaw tightened, but he didn't object. Fine. Since we're being direct, yes, I am concerned about your assets. Assets that, until recently, would have eventually benefited your daughter and grandchildren. They still will benefit my grandchildren, Margaret pointed out. Through the educational trusts I've established. And if Chloe lives with me during college, she'll benefit from my home and my guidance. Directly. Education isn't the only expense families face, James argued. There's retirement to consider, healthcare costs, potential emergencies. Your cabin and property represent significant capital that's essentially sitting idle when it could be working harder for the family's future security. Margaret took a sip of her coffee, considering her response carefully. She was conscious of the children watching this exchange, absorbing not just the words but the values being expressed. What lesson did she want them to learn from this moment? James, she said finally, I'd like to tell you a story. When Thomas and I first bought that property, most people thought we were crazy. 3 acres of undeveloped land, miles from town, with no utilities or infrastructure. Our friends told us we were throwing our money away. James looked impatient. But Margaret continued, her voice taking on the quiet authority that had commanded classrooms for decades. We paid $12,000 for that land in 1968. People said we could have bought a proper house in town for the same amount. But Thomas had a vision. He saw not what the property was worth then, but what it could become with care and investment over time. That's exactly my point, James interrupted. It's now worth over $2 million. A remarkable return on investment that should be leveraged. I'm not finished, Margaret said firmly. For 3 years, we camped on that land during summers while saving money to build. We dug the well ourselves. Thomas felled trees on the property to mill the lumber for the cabin. I planted every single pine tree that now lines the driveway. She looked around the table, meeting each family member's eyes in turn. That property isn't just an asset on a balance sheet, James. It's a physical representation of our life's work, our values, our dedication to building something meaningful and lasting. That's the true inheritance I want to pass on, not just the financial value, but the understanding of what makes something truly valuable. The kitchen fell silent. Even James seemed momentarily at a loss for words. I didn't know you and Grandpa built the cabin yourselves, Ryan said, his eyes wide with newfound appreciation. We did, Margaret confirmed. And when the roof needed replacing 20 years later, we did that ourselves too. Your grandfather was 70 years old, climbing up and down that ladder with bundles of shingles while I handed them up to him. Why didn't you just hire someone? Chloe asked, genuinely curious. We could have, Margaret acknowledged. By then, we had the money. But that wasn't the point. The point was that we took care of what we built. We invested our labor and love into it, not just our money. She turned back to James, who was watching her with an unreadable expression. That's what I'm trying to preserve, James. Not just the property itself, but what it represents. And I believe that's an inheritance worth far more than $2 million. Elizabeth reached across the table to place her hand over Margaret's. I understand, Mom. I should have seen it all along. James set his napkin on the table with a finality that suggested he was unmoved by Margaret's sentimentality. That's all very touching, Margaret, but it doesn't address the practical realities. Your investment portfolio, while well managed, has been generating returns below market average for the past 5 years. The property requires significant annual maintenance. And your decision to establish educational trusts rather than direct inheritance creates tax implications that, James, Elizabeth interrupted, her voice sharper than Margaret had heard in years. Stop. Just stop treating my mother like she's a financial problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. The rebuke seemed to startle him. He turned to his wife with a flash of anger. I'm being practical, Elizabeth. Someone has to be. Your mother lives in an isolated cabin worth millions, while we're facing potential downsizing at the hospital and struggling to maximize our retirement contributions. And that's her responsibility to solve. How? Elizabeth asked, a new firmness in her voice. By sacrificing her home and independence to secure our financial future? It's what families do, James insisted. They make sacrifices for each other. Yes, they do, Margaret agreed quietly. Thomas and I sacrificed for decades to provide Elizabeth with opportunities we never had. We paid for her college education, her first car, her wedding. We helped with the down payment on your first home. We babysit our grandchildren whenever needed, supported their activities, contributed to their education funds. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady on James. But sacrificing doesn't mean surrendering my autonomy or dignity. And it certainly doesn't mean allowing myself to be declared incompetent so you can gain control of my assets. The statement landed like a thunderclap in the kitchen. Elizabeth gasped, Chloe's eyes widened, and Ryan looked bewildered. What's she talking about, Dad? Ryan asked, his young face confused. James's face flushed dark red. That was a theoretical discussion, he said stiffly. A worst-case scenario if Margaret's condition deteriorated and she couldn't make sound decisions. My condition, Margaret repeated evenly. You mean my perfectly healthy cognitive and physical state, as certified by my doctor just last month? You had medical tests done? Elizabeth asked, surprise evident in her voice. I did, Margaret confirmed. As a precaution, given what I suspected might be coming. The results are on file with both my doctor and my attorney. I am, as Dr. Sheridan put it, remarkably healthy for a woman of any age, let alone 72. James's expression had shifted from embarrassment to calculation. Medical conditions can change rapidly at your age, Margaret. And isolated living creates its own risks. Which is why Chloe's proposal to stay with me during college is so elegant, Margaret pointed out. It addresses legitimate concerns about my living alone while respecting my autonomy and wishes. For 4 years, James countered. And then what? Margaret smiled, her expression serene. And then I'll be 76, James. Still likely quite capable of managing my own affairs, based on my family history and current health. My mother lived independently until she was 92, as you may recall. She could see him reassessing, adjusting his strategy in real time. James Cameron was nothing if not adaptable when his original plans were thwarted. Perhaps we've been approaching this all wrong, he said, his tone suddenly conciliatory. What if we looked at this as a partnership rather than an all-or-nothing proposition? What kind of partnership? Margaret asked cautiously. A financial one, James explained, warming to his new idea. You maintain ownership of the property during your lifetime, but we establish a trust that ensures it transfers to the family upon your passing. In return, we contribute to the property's maintenance and improvements, increasing its value for everyone's benefit. It was a clever pivot, acknowledging Margaret's emotional attachment to the property while still securing their eventual claim to it. She had to admit it showed more respect for her position than their previous approach. That's certainly a more reasonable suggestion than selling immediately, Margaret acknowledged. But it still assumes that the property's highest value is financial, rather than personal or educational. What if, Chloe interjected thoughtfully, we thought about it differently? What if Grandma's property became a kind of family legacy project? All eyes turned to her, and she continued with growing confidence. The cabin could become A place where our whole family connects with nature and learns self-sufficiency. Ryan and I could document Grandma's knowledge about the land, the wildlife, the sustainable living practices she and Grandpa developed. We could create something meaningful together, not just wait for an inheritance. Margaret felt a surge of pride at her granddaughter's vision. Here was someone who truly understood the deeper value of what Thomas had built, who saw beyond dollar signs to the legacy of knowledge and connection with the natural world. I like that idea, Ryan added enthusiastically. We could make videos about bird conservation efforts on the property, or how the cabin uses passive solar heating, or Grandma's organic gardening techniques. That's a lovely sentiment, James began, clearly preparing to dismiss the suggestion as impractical. But Elizabeth cut him off. No, they're right, she said firmly. Mom's property isn't just a financial asset, it's a repository of knowledge and values that we're at risk of losing. Dad was an environmental engineer before that field even had a name. The sustainable systems they built into that cabin were decades ahead of their time. She turned to James, her expression earnest. What if, instead of focusing on the property's market value, we recognized its educational value? The children could learn practical skills that no classroom would teach them. We could preserve Dad's environmental innovations for future generations. Margaret watched in amazement as the conversation shifted before her eyes. Suddenly, they were discussing not when she would sell her property, but how the family could engage with it meaningfully while she still lived there. It wasn't a complete resolution, she could see James's reservations in his carefully neutral expression, but it was a significant shift in perspective. I have a proposition, Margaret said finally. One that addresses both practical concerns and these more meaningful considerations. They all looked at her expectantly. Lifetime usage rights? James repeated, clearly intrigued despite himself. Yes. You could use the property as a family retreat, a rental income source, or even live there yourselves if circumstances warranted it. The only condition would be maintaining the environmental covenants Thomas and I established, protecting the wetland area, maintaining the forest management plan, and preserving the wildlife corridor along the eastern boundary. It was a meaningful compromise, acknowledging their legitimate interest in the property's future while preserving the conservation values that had been central to Thomas's vision. The property would still eventually go to the Conservation Trust, but not until after Elizabeth and James had benefited from it throughout their lifetimes. That's worth considering, James said slowly, the financial implications clearly calculating behind his eyes. Additionally, Margaret continued, I'd like to establish regular family weekends at the cabin, perhaps monthly, where we can all work on documenting and preserving the knowledge and techniques Thomas and I developed. Not just for our family, but potentially as educational resources for others interested in sustainable living. Like a legacy project, Chloe said, her eyes bright with excitement. We could create a website, maybe even a book eventually. Exactly, Margaret agreed. And James, I believe your expertise in healthcare administration could be valuable in developing the documentation systems and potential outreach programs. It was a deliberate olive branch, acknowledging James's professional skills and offering him a meaningful role in the project beyond just financial management. She could see him responding to the respect implicit in the suggestion. I could certainly help develop a strategic plan for such an initiative, he acknowledged, his tone noticeably warmer. Elizabeth was watching this exchange with a mixture of hope and caution. This sounds like a real compromise, something that honors everyone's concerns and capabilities. But Mom, what about your financial security? If you're keeping the property rather than selling it, will you have enough liquid assets for your needs? It was a legitimate question, asked out of genuine concern rather than financial self-interest. Margaret appreciated the distinction. My pension from the school district is quite adequate for my daily needs, she explained. And Thomas's investments continue to provide additional income. I'm not wealthy by modern standards, but I have enough, which is a form of wealth in itself, isn't it? The question hung in the air, a gentle challenge to the values that had been driving this conflict from the beginning. What constituted enough? When did prudent financial planning cross the line into unhealthy fixation on accumulation? I have one more condition, Margaret added, her voice taking on a more serious tone. This conversation about having me declared incompetent, that ends now. Completely and permanently. James had the grace to look uncomfortable. As I said, that was a theoretical, it doesn't matter what it was, Margaret interrupted firmly. It showed a fundamental disrespect for my autonomy and dignity. I need your explicit agreement that such measures will never be considered again, under any circumstances. Elizabeth placed her hand on James's arm. She's right, James. That crossed a line we should never have approached. After a moment of tense silence, James nodded. You have my word, he said to Margaret. No guardianship proceedings or similar measures will ever be pursued. Thank you, Margaret said simply. Ryan, who had been listening to this adult conversation with remarkable patience, suddenly spoke up. Does this mean we'll still have Christmas at Grandma's cabin like always? The question, so innocent and yet so central to what they'd been discussing, broke the tension. Elizabeth smiled at her son. Yes, sweetheart. Christmas at Grandma's cabin, just like always. With Grandma's special gingerbread cookies, he pressed. With Grandma's special gingerbread cookies, Margaret confirmed, her heart lightening at the thought. And perhaps this year, I'll teach you and Chloe how to make them yourselves. It's time I passed down that recipe. Family recipes and family property, Elizabeth mused. Both forms of inheritance that matter more than money, aren't they? They are, Margaret agreed. And speaking of family recipes, I believe I promised to help Ryan with his project this morning. If breakfast is finished, perhaps we could move to the living room where there's more space to spread out his materials? As they cleared the table together, a family united in purpose again, if still healing from recent wounds, Margaret felt a profound sense of gratitude. The crisis had been painful, yes, but it had forced conversations that were long overdue. It had revealed values and priorities that might otherwise have remained unexamined until it was too late. Most importantly, it had reminded all of them that the true wealth of a family couldn't be measured in property values or investment portfolios. It resided in the knowledge they shared, the memories they created, and the values they passed from one generation to the next. As she sat beside Ryan, helping him organize his research data, Margaret glanced out the window at the Montana winter landscape. The snow-covered mountains stood as they had for millennia, a reminder that individual lives were brief, but legacies could endure through time if nurtured with wisdom and care. Grandma, Ryan said, interrupting her thoughts, do you think Grandpa would be proud of my project? Using science to help protect the birds? Oh, Ryan, Margaret replied, her throat tightening with emotion. He would be more proud than words could express. This is exactly the kind of legacy he hoped to inspire, young people using knowledge to care for the natural world. Ryan beamed at her words, then returned to his careful graphing of bird migration data. Across the room, Chloe and Elizabeth were deep in conversation about the teaching program at Montana State, while James sat nearby, his laptop open but his attention clearly on his family rather than his work. It wasn't perfect harmony. There would be more difficult conversations ahead, more negotiations and compromises needed. But they had found their way back to what mattered most, family bonds that transcended financial considerations, love that couldn't be quantified in dollars and cents. Margaret had refused to be diminished or dismissed because of her age. She had stood firm in her convictions while remaining open to legitimate concerns. And in doing so, she had taught her family one final, crucial lesson, that dignity and autonomy were birthrights that belonged to every person, regardless of age or circumstances. As the morning sun climbed higher in the Montana sky, casting its golden light across the family gathered in the living room, Margaret Sullivan knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. Not just for herself, but for generations to come. Later that afternoon, as Margaret prepared to return to her hotel before the drive back to Whitefish the following day, Elizabeth walked her to the door. Mom, she said quietly, out of James's earshot, I need to apologize again. Not just for what was said and done, but for not standing up sooner. For letting things get this far. Margaret embraced her daughter warmly. We all make mistakes, Elizabeth. The important thing is learning from them. I've learned so much these past few days, Elizabeth admitted. About courage, about priorities, about standing up for what's right even when it's difficult. Then something good has come from this crisis, Margaret observed. And that's all we can ever hope for when facing life's challenges, that we emerge wiser and stronger on the other side. As she drove away from the Cameron home, Margaret felt a sense of peace settling over her. The road ahead would have its bumps and turns, certainly. James's cooperation might waver, new financial pressures might arise, her own health might eventually present genuine concerns. But she had secured what mattered most, her dignity, her autonomy, and her ability to pass on not just material assets but values and knowledge to her grandchildren. She had refused to be seen as merely an obstacle to inheritance, insisting instead on recognition as a person with agency and wisdom still to contribute. And in that refusal, firm but not bitter, principled but not unyielding, she had offered her family a final, priceless lesson about aging with grace and standing up for one's worth, regardless of years. The mountains of Montana rose around her as she drove, ancient witnesses to the brief, complicated, beautiful lives of the humans who dwelled in their shadow. Margaret Sullivan had claimed her place among them, not as someone whose usefulness had ended, but as an elder whose voice deserved respect and whose legacy would continue to nourish generations to come. As the highway curved toward home, she smiled at the thought of Chloe living with her during college, of Ryan's visits to work on his science projects, of family weekends documenting Thomas's environmental innovations. This wasn't the ending. Her daughter and son-in-law had envisioned when they'd approached her about selling her home. It was something better, a new beginning built on honesty, respect, and the enduring power of love that transcended mere inheritance. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.